Welcome to this special virtual conversation for Rotary's World Immunization Week. I'm Sarah Tetzloff, the team lead for Polio Plus Communications, and today we're bringing you an important discussion on the power of vaccines. Joining us are two incredible voices in global health. We have a polio survivor, broadcaster, and vaccine advocate, Addie Adepitan, and Darla Silva, Chief Program Officer at UNICEF USA. Together, they'll discuss the life saving impact of immunization, the progress we've made in the fight against polio, and what still needs to be done. This exclusive conversation is happening during World Immunization Week right here on Rotary's social channels. Make sure that you're spreading awareness about the critical role vaccines play in protecting lives. Now, let's dive into the conversation. Addie and Darla, it's nice to see you.
Lovely to see you.
Great. Thanks. And thank you to Rotary for giving me this terrific opportunity to speak with Ade. Ade, let's start by telling us your personal story and how you became a polio eradication advocate.
Wow, personal story. So, I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and I had an older sister. She's a year older than me, and she was born with Down syndrome. But when I was born, I was born healthy. All everything was fine, and then when I got to 15 months. I unfortunately contracted polio. I had a really bad fever overnight. My parents took me into hospital, and then I woke up the next day, and my parents were told that I had polio. So, in over the course of one night, my parents went from having one child with a disability to two children with disabilities in Lagos, Nigeria, in the 70s. And this, as you can imagine, had a incredibly dramatic impact on our lives. Totally turned our whole world upside down. And my parents had to make some big decisions at the time. They were like, "How are my kids going to survive in a country where there's no infrastructure for people with disabilities? How's it going to work?" And so my parents decided to use all their savings, and they borrowed money from their friends and family, and decided to move to the UK. But they could only afford to bring just one of us at the beginning. They could only afford to bring either myself or my sister, and they made the agonizing choice of choosing me because my disability was physical. And my mum said when I was crawling around on the ground, there was lots of open sewage out there at the time. She just felt that I wasn't going to survive. So the idea was to take me over to the UK and then raise enough money to bring my sister over later on, which is what they did. And moved to the UK. It was the best decision my parents could have ever made for us because it created so many opportunities, opened so many doors for me. I ended up becoming a Paralympic athlete and then working in TV. And then once when I was in TV, I had many opportunities to talk about polio and polio eradication. I connected with Rotary International because of the incredible wonderful campaign that Rotary members have been doing. I think they're really at the forefront of the groups of people that are out there trying to eradicate polio around the world. And it was for me, it was just amazing to meet people who cared so much about something that had affected my family's life for such a big chunk of our lives. And so it was a no-brainer for me to start working with Rotary International to try and spread the word and help sort of to try and eradicate polio. And also another big moment, I guess, in my sort of world of learning about polio eradication is I also used my platform as a TV presenter to make a documentary in 2013, I think it was, where I went back to Nigeria to make a film about why, at the time, Nigeria was still one of the few countries in the world that had where polio was endemic. So yeah, it's been a journey. It's been a journey.
Such a powerful story, and your perspective is so important. How has having had polio and living with its effects given you about the importance of vaccination?
Well, look, I we live in a world where as much as there've been a lot of advances, there are still many barriers for people with disabilities. And growing up with polio, I've had to face all of those challenges and all of those barriers, and also there is the added issue of potentially getting for polio to I forget what it's called, the later on, where you can get post polio syndrome. So all of that is looming large over myself as well, and it's made me really feel how important it is to educate people and make sure people immunize their children. I've got two children of my own, a 4-year old and my new daughter. She's only 5 weeks old, and for me, the first thing in my mind is to get them vaccinated, to get them immunized, to make sure that they don't have to go through what I went through. So to me, I just think it's probably one of the most important things a parent can do for their child is to get them immunized. We are so fortunate that in this day and age that there is an opportunity and there's a way of immunizing and protecting our children from diseases like polio. It's not like 50, 60 years ago. There is this opportunity. So I try in any which way I can to try and spread the message for people to make sure they immunize their children.
You've built this amazing, groundbreaking career. And how do you continue to keep striving for change?
Ooh, keep striving for change. Well, there's so much work to do, isn't there? I think it's probably not the most fashionable thing these days, but I come from a place of empathy. I'm able to look at other people's lives and try and see the world through other people's lives and understand the challenges that they go through, and I also realize that you know I don't want any other person to go through the challenges that I've gone through, and I feel like as well this the world could be better. We are not in the best place that we can be. There at the moment you have over 250 million children in the world who haven't got access to education. You've got millions of children who haven't got access to being immunized and to having those vital the drugs that will stop them from catching childhood diseases. You've got massive amounts of poverty. And I just have this burning desire to try and do something about it. And maybe it comes from the fact that I'm a sportsman, and where I come from a sporting background. I've played high level elite sport pretty much all my life, and what we look for is the best. That we're looking to try and find a way for us ourselves and the people around us to be the best that they can possibly be, and that's kind of what I do, or what I want to do with my life. I'm obviously I do what I love in working in TV, and my family is amazing, but I also get a buzz out of helping other people improve their lives. And as I said, there's a lot of work to do, and this is not the best that the world can be. Let's keep striving for that world, and we need a world of empathy, because without empathy, we're just going to tear ourselves apart. And what is a world where we're all constantly fighting and tearing each other apart?
I love that. That's so inspiring. Thank you for sharing your story. I'd like to now talk about the importance of vaccines. What has been your experience when talking to people about vaccines?
Yeah, I think it's generally been positive. When you speak to other parents and families, they want to vaccinate their kids. But also, we can't hide from it. There has been some really difficult periods. The Andrew Wakefield stuff with MMR, that whole scandal has and when you merge that with the internet and social media, where people are following conspiracy theories, and there is this small pocket of people who are vaccine deniers, and that can be challenging. It can be really challenging because, I when I speak to those people, I look at them and I think, if only, if only I'd had enough, if only I'd had the polio vaccine in time, then I wouldn't have had this disability. My parents wouldn't have gone through everything they've gone through. And for you to basically deny it and say that it doesn't work, it's a really luxurious position to come from. A position of where you've not had to deal with the disease. So look, generally it's positive. Most people want their kids to be immunized and want vaccines to be used all over the world to help bring back down diseases. But yes, we've still got a battle to get out there to make sure that that it's something that's everybody buys into.
And have your conversations about vaccines changed in recent years?
Well, yeah, I think it's gone from, in the past where people didn't even talk. It was just like, yeah, it was a given, I'm going to get my child vaccinated. But now there's more of a conversation about it. I think we can't forget what happened in 2020 with the COVID pandemic around the world. It's got everybody talking about what we put inside our bodies and how we protect ourselves and how we protect future generations. So it's a more in-depth conversation, which is I welcome. I think it's really important that we have open, sometimes challenging conversations. But it's also important that people look at the data, and look at the data and look at the damage that not having vaccines can do to children, especially when you're coming from low-income countries in the global south, where they are, where if your child isn't vaccinated and they catch polio, it's kind of almost like a death sentence, and it's something that no parent should have to go through. And I feel like we have an opportunity to eradicate polio because we are so close. And what eradicating polio does, right, is it sends out this huge message. It's not just saving lives, not just saving lives of children, not just building up our immunization base to make sure that there's enough people who carry the antibodies to fight off the diseases. But it's also sending a message saying, look what we can do as a human race. We've only ever eradicated one other disease, and that was smallpox. If we can eradicate polio, that's historic. That is historic. That's millions of lives we saved. That's generations of children who will never ever have to deal with it. And hey, if you're a vaccine skeptic, you'll never have to talk about the polio vaccine anymore because you would have eradicated polio. So let's do it. It's a win-win situation.
Thank you for that. That's such an important message. But what messages do you have for people who are hesitant about vaccines?
I think let's have the conversation. Have a conversation. Speak to experts. Speak to doctors. Speak to the vaccine experts, people who have got the data and who've got the knowledge. But also look and look at the bigger picture. Look outside of your world and look and meet people or hear the voices of people who've been impacted by polio, who've been impacted by childhood diseases, right? See how devastating these diseases can be to families and to young children. And then look at it and make your decision there. Do you really want to put your child at risk to something like this?
That's also powerful messages and a reminder that it's also so preventable.
Yeah.
What gives you hope and inspiration about progress towards polio eradication?
um, I think Rotary International gives me hope. Seriously, because you guys have been in it for the long run. You've been there from the beginning, consistently fighting for the eradication of polio. When people haven't been talking about it, when there's been a lot of criticism, when you've had to do loads of fundraising, but you've been there. That consistency, and to have a group as incredible, as global as Rotary International, championing the cause of polio eradication, for me is heartwarming. It's emotional, and it speaks to the power of who we are as humans. Being able to be able to look at the plight of others and say, we can, and we want to make a difference. And it also says something about communities. It's an example of what you can do as a community. We can talk about technology and social media and all of this other stuff, but what it boils down to is our communities. And what community is just another word for family. It's an extended family. And the Rotary International family have done an incredible job. So I want to say a huge thank you, for sticking the course and being there and fighting for polio eradication.
A large part of eradicating polio from this planet is about raising awareness. Tell us about some of your advocacy work. What have you been doing to raise awareness about polio eradication and about disability awareness and rights?
So I've tried to use my platform to talk about disability awareness and disability rights, and I mentioned earlier I traveled to Nigeria to make a documentary about polio and the challenges that certain countries are having eradicating polio. But I think the biggest and most powerful way you can get the message out there is to speak to polio survivors. And that's what I did when I went out to Nigeria. I met the people who have survived polio and have had the infection and are living with the impacts of polio, and hearing what they've been through, hearing their challenges, and seeing what they need and what they want. That's so important in this world, which is so noisy. There's so much distractions out there. It's really hard for the real people, the people who are really impacted, to get their voices out there. So I think it's so important. If you have that opportunity, give people a voice. Give them that chance to talk about their story so we can see the whole person. Too many of us live in these closed worlds, cocooned in this echo chamber, this bubble where we only speak to like-minded people, and what that does is it creates prejudice. It turns us into these people who believe the world is all this zero-sum game where, if someone else wins, we have to lose. It's not about that. It's not about that.
So powerful. And you mentioned this earlier, but that we are so close with only two countries left where polio is endemic, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as you
Mhm.
mentioned, polio would be only the second disease to ever be eradicated, the first being smallpox. So, what message do you have for Rotarians and future generations about keeping up the fight to end polio?
You know, nothing worth doing is easy. It's there's no challenge out there which can make huge differences and have huge impacts, which come simple and just fall on your lap. It's all about staying the course and working hard, but just remembering that you're not alone. You are not alone. You know, there are Rotarians all over the world. There are people all over the world who are rooting for this, for polio eradication. You know, it will happen. It will happen. I totally believe it will happen. And when it does happen, you will have your place in history for doing something that's absolutely monumental for the human race. You would have saved millions of lives and improved the world, made the world a better place. So yeah, keep going. You know, the last mile is always the hardest, but you're almost there. We're almost there.
Love it. Do you have a favorite story that you could share about your time as a polio eradication advocate?
Favorite story, I guess. When I went to Nigeria to meet polio survivors and to tell the story of polio in Nigeria, um, I met a group of guys, and there was I think there was one young lady with them, and they were called the Boys Under the Bridge. And the reason why they were called the Boys Under the Bridge is because they lived under a highway bridge in Lagos, Nigeria, because they had disabilities and they were either kicked out of their homes or too poor to have their own places. None of these guys could walk, but they couldn't afford wheelchairs. They crafted wooden boards. You may have seen these type people traveling on these vehicles in countries like Nigeria and India as well. They do it in Ghana, but they get a piece of board and they stick roller skate wheels underneath, and then they have flip flops on their hands, and they go round on these boards. And they were and I met these group of guys, and they were selling charge cards, which are cards that basically put data on your phones. You know, they were buying them and then selling them on the sides of the streets, trying to earn money and just hustle. And I just looked at them and I just started admired and was in awe of of what these guys were doing against all the odds, living on the streets in one of the hardest places in the world to live on, in Lagos, Nigeria, and sleeping under a subway. You know, it was just a tough existence. And when I spoke to them, you know, they were so determined, so focused, even after all they'd been through. And you know what they said to me? They said, we're coming together as our own community. More and more people are finding out about them. They played this thing called para soccer, which is like football and skateboards. And they said, we're going to save the money from these that we're making selling these charge cards. And when we save the money, we're going to buy these electric tuk-tuks. And one of them was a little bit of an engineer, wizard type, and he said we're going to adapt these tuk-tuks so we can use them with hand controls, and then we're going to go out there and we're going to work as taxi drivers in our own disabled tuk-tuk business. And he said we're going to do this, and watch this space. And I went back and I revisited those guys 4 years later, and sure enough, they had 6 or 7 of their own tuk-tuks, which they'd like managed to save up and buy, and they had their own tuk-tuk business. They went from nothing against all odds to set up this business. You know, they weren't feeling sorry for themselves. They were just doing something genuinely amazing. And that for me gives me so much hope when you see people like that. You know, they shouldn't have to do what they've done. They shouldn't have to struggle in the way they've struggled, but look what they've done. And that, for you Rotarians, should give you hope. They're fighting, so you've got to keep on fighting.
One final question for you. How do you plan to celebrate when polio eradication has been achieved?
I'm going to find my nearest Rotary Club, and I'm going to bring a big giant bottle of champagne and crack it open, and we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate. I think it's only fitting that I go and celebrate with the people who stayed the course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.